a lot of parking. It was downtown at Metro Hall. And has my admiration, and he knows it because I tell him all the time. He's done a great job with the Freedom Party of Ontario. He took that party over about 12 years ago, and he worked day and night making that party go. Now, Bob tells me that, and he ran 17 people in all, 17 people, Bob, in the last election?
12.
12, okay. 12 candidates in the last Ontario election. And they accumulated many votes on behalf of the conservative spectrum of our society because he said the right thing. Now, Bob has argued and fought and most recently battled with the shutdown of London. He has gone into and personally undertaken to represent a landlord who was falsely accused of racism in his treatment of his tenants, and battled that one through about 3 years in the Human Rights Tribunal, and won. And Bob is not a lawyer. Bob is a dedicated Canadian through and through, and he is all for people in our society being able to be free, able to go about their business and do things without the interference of the government at every hand, the way it used to be. So, Bob, I really take a great pleasure in introducing Bob Metz.
Well, thank you, Dick. That was a very powerful opening. I'm glad you mentioned that I wasn't a lawyer. It's funny you should bring that up because I've been told many times that the reason I won before the Human Rights Commission, and I'm convinced of it myself, is that it was because I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't have to follow the prescribed legalities that lawyers are bound to so that I could play to the evidence rather than to the law. And that's sort of the situation we're in today in Canada. We're in a country that is more concerned about being correct legally through the law than it is about doing the right thing on a very human level. But that's not what I'm here to talk about tonight. I'm here to talk about, basically, the census that's coming up pretty soon. I figured that would be the subject to talk about since Voice of Canadians' next campaign will be the Mark Me Canadian campaign, and I think it's a terrific campaign. Census by race, what a disgrace. Well, there has been a previous anti-census campaign. It was actually organized by some people in our party. I'll get into that shortly. But basically, censuses go back a long way. And I have a slightly different opinion of a census than most people may have. But to give you my perspective, I think we should really begin at the beginning. Really at the beginning. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. This was the first enrollment. When I think it's Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be enrolled, each to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And that, of course, is from the Bible, Luke 2. It has been almost 2,000 years since Caesar's first census, and it is only 3 months away from Canada's next census. Perhaps we should count our blessings that we as Canadian citizens don't have to return to our places of origin to be enumerated. Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue if we had to do that? Isn't it funny, though, you think of the census as being a picture of something that exists in time. What they did then was change the whole situation around to fit the census. Well, the funny thing is, they're still doing that today. Even so, our Canadian census is still an instrument of government and would lead to the same kind of chaos, the kind of questions we're asking on it today, that would have been created back then by forcing everyone to go back to their place of origin. True, our government does not force us to return to our places of origin, but it does force us to report on our place of origin now, and the effect will be the same. It is no coincidence that the world's first census occurred during Rome's transition from a strong republic to a weak empire. I'm not suggesting that it's cause and effect. The cause of all breakdowns of great civilizations occurs when government of the time grows too large, has too many powers, and no longer can guarantee any specific rights of its citizens. The Canadian government is now in that position. And the questions we are forced by law to answer on the Canadian census are simply a symptom, a consequence, of a government which has abandoned its proper function of guaranteeing individual rights in favor of social engineering. That's why I'm here tonight. I'm here to state a case against the very idea of even having a universal government-enforced census in the first place. I think it's a colossal waste of time, money, energy, and more importantly, I am firmly convinced that the information collected by our government will be used against us, to the detriment of our individual well-being and ultimately to the destruction of our own country. Past censuses have forced Canadians to provide the government with information on what language was spoken in the privacy of their own home, how much they paid in rent, mortgage payments, property taxes, power, and fuel bills. Canadians were asked how many rooms they had in their homes, how many bathrooms. They've been expected to provide their marital status, their religion, size of the family home. And as government has grown and gets more and more out of control, the questions asked on the census reflect the political environment in which they are at. Long ago, in 1971, former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker referred to the census questions then as a form of snoopocracy and predicted that many Canadians would pay the then $300 maximum fine or go to jail rather than answer the census. Diefenbaker, of course, was quite disappointed in his fellow Canadians, having underestimated the degree to which deference to authority has become a strong trait in this country. Out of nearly 20 million or so residents who filled out the census in 1971, only about 20 people actually got in trouble with the law during that period. The actual fact is, I think most Canadians still can't see what there is to get upset about when it comes to having to fill out a census. And that shouldn't be too surprising. After all, our familiarity with the census goes all the way back to the days of Caesar Augustus. You know, so what's really the big deal, people ask? Censuses have been around for thousands of years. They're only a head count, and our governments need the information to do their job properly, right? Our politicians just need the information to help them determine the government's goals and targets, don't they? To which I cynically reply, yes. And that's the big deal. That's exactly why you should be worried. Let's look at some basic facts about the Canadian census. Just some basic facts. I've got a copy of my last one here, from 1986. I never filled it out, by the way. I'm not one of those people who cooperated. But it's interesting looking at the last one. I've still got a photocopy of it here. And it says, for confidential when completed. Your name's not on the census, by the way. It's broken down, province, federal number. I don't know what EA number stands for, or EN, but these all have a use, obviously. And then there's household numbers. And these are distributed to each household. And names are not put on, but someone in the household is always responsible for filling these out. Now, of course, one of the questions in the past has always been, if the census isn't filled out, which person in the household gets charged? And that has been an issue in the past, and it has generally been left unresolved. But basically, here's some facts about the census. Number one, it's held every 5 years, with a major census every alternate census. So you got a big one every 10 years and a smaller one every 5 years. Traditionally, the censuses have been on June 3rd. The 1996 census will be the first one to be held on May 14th. And this time, only about 20% of Canadians will be required to participate. I found it interesting. I was looking at an article in our London Free Press, in London where I'm from, Southam newspapers, and they say that our first national census taking began 330 years ago. I think there's already a problem in definition of nation when we get a story like that in the paper. The Statistics Act, Section 29, provides for a fine not exceeding $500 or 3 months in jail or both for, quote, knowingly giving false or misleading information, whether caused by refusal or neglect or false answer or deception. Another fact about the census. Cost of the census in 1981, $102 million. Cost this year, $350 million. Now they say over an 8-year cycle. I don't understand that, because since they have a census every 5 years, why are they budgeting over an 8-year cycle? By the time we get to the second census, we're already overlapping. So a lot of the things that we get in terms of what we're told in the media about the census are simply not accurate. And I've run into a number of instances like that. Census questions are completely political. There's absolutely no argument about that. You won't get anybody in the government arguing about it. You won't get anybody in the public arguing about it. It's taken as a matter of fact. They're political. The questions on this year's census culminated with Statistics Canada having done some very heavy lobbying this time around to get $55 million from other government departments and agencies who basically have a stake in the census industry. And these include Citizenship and Immigration, Heritage, Health Canada, Human Resources Development, Industry and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. All these groups pitched in to make sure that they were, quote, represented on the census this year. The 1996 census will be the first to allow, finally, and this I just learned yesterday, the answer Canadian in response to questions dealing with ancestry. And I think you can already give yourselves a good hand for that one, because it's the pressure of groups like this and the Reform Party and other groups that have been working to get that one acknowledgement onto a Canadian census. 1996 census will also be the first to measure what they call unpaid work, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail as I carry on a little later. The 1996 census will be the first to no longer ask how many people staying in your house on census day live elsewhere or are just staying overnight. The 1996 census will also drop questions relating to how many live births women have had, whether a home is owned or rented, and who pays the taxes and electricity. Now what's interesting, the reason they gave for dropping these questions from the census was that they decided that these questions violated people's sense of privacy. And what did they do? They went and replaced them with these questions about race and about things that are perhaps even more private to people. So that's really not the reason they replaced the questions. What really happened was the political climate has changed. They want different answers because they have different plans. Justification for a forced census and how the information will be used is going to be outlined in the form of a census guide prepared by who else? The people giving us the census, Statistics Canada. The only publicly given reason for having a census that I've seen so far in the papers this year, and I've gone through all kinds of articles, and it's just, you see it over and over again, so that employment equity laws can be properly administered. It seems like that's the number one, number two, number three, four, five, six, and 10th reason for the 1996 census. You know, when you look back at the old censuses, and they have a little, I highlighted them all here, all their reasons for asking certain questions, things haven't changed. These issues have existed all the time. For example, the census is important to you in many ways, says the census. With census results, better plans can be made for your health care, for improved daycare facilities, for such things as roads, businesses, and schools. The census means better planning for pensions, youth employment, and for the needs of the disabled. And, you know, it's interesting, it also says the information you give is kept secret. And it is used only to produce statistics. No one else has any way of getting at this. And I have a little note I wrote here that I remember at the time. I've written here that the envelope provided with the return can't even be sealed. It didn't have glue on it. You had to fold the flap in on the top so that anybody could read it. So that's how you put the thing in the mail. Now, of course, your name's not on it, so I guess that's why they figure it's secret. But if anybody knows who you were and happened to run into it, well, it wouldn't be a secret anymore. You know, they ask even, why do they ask for your birth date, for example? Well, they say information on that is essential for projecting, future population trends, and a better understanding of social and economic changes. It is a key element in planning for a community's needs, such as daycare facilities, schools, and senior citizen housing. Question number 4, which is about sex. This question is vital in studying population trends. Data classified by sex are needed to understand the changing social and economic roles between men and women. And on and on. I mean, mother tongue data are used in programs which protect and promote rights and privileges established by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and by the Official Languages Act. This is all in here. It's all in the 1986 census. If they tell you that this is the first census that we've ever been asked racial questions on, and they have told us also it's the first one where like the CIT 96 is the first one where you can decide for yourself whether you want to consider yourself an Aboriginal. That's not true. It's right here. There's the question number 7. Do you consider yourself an Aboriginal person or Native Indian of North America? It's really funny reading the papers and having the papers tell us all the new things that are going to be in the census, and then picking out an old census and seeing that they've always been there. It's back to that memory thing. The voter has a short memory, so does the census filler outer, I guess. By the time you get around to the next one, you forgot the questions that you answered on the last one. But on it goes, the reasons. And of course, one big reason for a census is that it creates temporary employment for government people. In fact, the last census in '86 produced what they call temporary employment for 45,000 Canadians, including 25,000 students hired through government youth employment programs. I know from a campaign that one group ran that most of the people that got hired through these things, the basic criteria was that you had connections with the Liberal Party. And this was a pretty well-known inside thing, and that's how you got onto the census roster in terms of getting paid to do something. So those are the basic facts. Unfortunately, the fact that an increasing number of Canadians are only now becoming upset because of some explicitly racist questions which are offensive in some ways has been a bit of a mystery, as I mentioned, because equally racial questions have always been asked in the past. But in the past, the explicitly racial questions were only confined to Aboriginals, who you might be interested to know also had their own separate Statistics Canada census taken in 1991. They call it the Aboriginal People Survey. It's done as a secondary part of the Canadian census, in which they questioned 625,000 Indians, Métis, and Inuit about their language and lifestyle. Now, of course, a census in and of itself is not an issue at all. Let's be serious about this, regardless of what questions you put on the darn thing. People have filled out questionnaires that have included information on everything from the brand of tea or coffee they drink to their favorite sexual position. But the fundamental issue is this. When you are forced, by law, to provide personal information about yourself or face threats of fines and imprisonment for failing to do so, we have a very serious situation on our doorstep. One that I think threatens the very foundation of our country. And to make matters worse, if we objectively look at what our governments are doing with the information we're forced to provide them with, we should be terrified at the direction in which we're heading. I've become personally convinced that everyone who participates in Canada's census, such as it is today, is, whether wittingly or not, that person's helping participate in the destruction of this country. The fact that we may be participating unwittingly or because we're forced to do so by law will not alter the destructive consequences of going through this exercise. In fact, our being forced to participate in the first place is already a symptom of what's wrong with this country. That they would think like that. So, from where I'm coming from, I just can't see any sort of justification for a universal forced census. In fact, the census collectors in the last going back to 1981, our party back then interviewed a couple of people anonymously who were census collectors. And one of them told some very interesting stories. He particularly pointed out how when you have a 100% forced census that everyone has to fill out, you get very distorted data. If people don't want to give information about themselves, they give false information. There's a lot of people hiding from the tax man, hiding from Immigration Canada, hiding from all sorts of groups that don't want to be identified on a census. And so they go out of their way to skewer the results. In fact, scientifically, a smaller sampling done voluntarily by people who want to participate is much more accurate than anything you can do by a forced sampling of 100% of the people. As strange as that may sound, it's true. And they've proven this over and over and over again. And yet our country seems to think that we have to go on with this approach to the census. Marketing companies can take a pretty accurate sample of what the market conditions are out there without having to interview every single customer of the Visco shredded wheat. They only have to talk to 100 or 200 of them. And they know what they need to know. Now, 1981 saw the first organized resistance in Canada. It was formed by several founding members of what is now Freedom Party. They called it Census Resistance 81. And they formed it basically on the principles that they felt it was immoral to force anyone to provide information under threat of penalty by law, information about themselves, and that it is immoral to force people to pay for services that they would not otherwise subscribe to. And this is really what is at the heart of the whole census process. Count me out was their message, and the theme of their campaign. It culminated with both key organizers of the census resistance campaign, who were at the time Mary Lou Gutcher and Mark Harrington, with tearing up their personal census forms in front of the cameras, in front of the media and the public in Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. They were supported by then Toronto Sun columnist and former alderman Laura Savia, who drew a particularly warm applause from the crowd at the anti-census rally on June 3rd that day, when she pointed out that it's unfair to subsidize business with taxpayers' money, and that census information gathered to benefit business is no exception to that rule. But, as usual, the message was lost on most Canadians, and most complied with the government's forced request to provide information about themselves. So why do Canadians put up with a politically arbitrary questionnaire about their personal lives every 5 years? The main answer that I generally come up with is that by and large, Canadians still do trust their government because they believe most of what they've been told. You know, it comes down to being fooled again, I think. I think it's a naivety of the highest order. The census, I think, is a cyclical fraud perpetrated upon Canadians every 5 years under the guise of providing some unstated and never achieved form of better government. What is better government anyway? Would we know it if we saw it? When do we ever get to see any of the results? Before or after the next census? When's the deadline? Will we ever get government that a true majority of people want? If the past indications of what government has done with its census data, are any indication, rather, we seem to get worse government with every passing census. The Canadian census, in fact, I think, has become a national symbol of this country's submission to the doctrine of government planning, which is an oxymoron if there ever was one. It's like talking about round squares and square circles. Governments of free nations are not social planning instruments, and could not effectively become such even if everyone wanted the government to run their own lives. Every society ever built upon such a principle has perished. But every society built on a principle of individual rights has prospered to the degree that it adheres to that principle. Waver away from it, things get worse. You get back to it, things seem to get better, like magic. And the hallmark of any free society lies in the right of its individual citizens to act as individuals, free from the tyranny of any group or government. Nobody plans your life for you. In a free society, individuals choose their own destinies. They're not forced by financial status, class, religion, sexual, ethnic, or racial backgrounds to make choices prescribed by others or to support choices made by others. In a free society, individuals are free to choose. They're free to say no to any arbitrary obligation or demand imposed upon them by others, including groups, including businesses, including unions, and yes, even including governments. It's important to maintain our awareness of this because this is the standard against which I am presently making all my comments. I think that when I make a comment, when I criticize government, I criticize it against the standard of freedom. That is the standard by which I judge things to be good or evil. Totalitarianism is evil. Freedom is good. Pretty simple. But we tend to forget it because in the practice of these principles on a day-to-day basis, the reality seems to get lost. You know you're in an unfree society when individual citizens fear reprisal from their government for reasons that are not related to criminal activity. It's a pretty good litmus test. That's why I think the Canadian census is yet another tragic, glaring piece of evidence that Canada is no longer a free society. To think that any of us, who should each be free solely by our definition as Canadian citizens, could face threats of fines or imprisonment for not completing a state-ordered census form is just unconscionable. There are only two ways to right the wrongs inherent in the census process. We must either abolish the census entirely, which is my personal preference, or we should make it voluntary. With those using the information, not taxpayers, please, covering the cost of the census, and with everyone participating voluntarily. Now, as much as a voluntary census is, to me, a heck of a lot better than what we have now, it's still my personal choice to get rid of the census altogether, and for very much broader reasons, and these are the reasons I want to bring to your attention this evening. I think that when you can see the logic of an argument, in this case on the census, why the whole census is a sham to begin with, it'll make your case against certain aspects of the census, against trying to address, for example, the racial issue on the census, that much more powerful. Because you've got that ace in the hole that you can use if people want to give you too much friction on that. You know, when politicians and bureaucrats don't have any rational reasons for most of the social programs they force us to support, they know that they can justify them with the next best thing. They use statistics. Our governments have promoted a culture of statistics at the expense of reason, of morality, and just plain old-fashioned common sense. 20% of people are unemployed, underemployed, disadvantaged, overadvantaged, whatever. The given assumption in quoting such a statistic is that the government has to do something about it. And whenever governments do something, it means more laws, more bureaucracy, more taxes, and less freedom. It is the nature of government. Government is an inhibitory instrument. It does not create freedom, it can only preserve it. Statistics are a powerful weapon to use against the citizenry. And that's why I think we have a statistics candidate. And I think that's why Caesar Augustus needed a census. Remember, any collection of statistics presupposes an objective. Don't ever fall for that line that a census exists to help the government determine its objectives, as so many people seem to believe. I run into that all the time. It's not true. After all, if you're going to go in the stamp collecting business, the statistical information you need would have to relate to stamps. Which stamps are available, how many in supply, how many collectors, which markets are the largest, which markets are the smallest. You certainly would not be collecting statistics on comic book collectors, or you wouldn't care about comic book collectors. They don't even exist as far as you're concerned. You can't ask questions until you already know what the purpose of the question is going to be. The information you collect has to be based on your already existing objective. It cannot be used as government representatives continually tell us for the purpose of determining the government's objectives. This is an outright lie and can be extensively documented by the government's own admission that it already has its objectives in place and that it only needs a census statistics to carry out its agenda. Now, a government that collects and segregates information on the basis of personal income, racial or ethnic background, or any other such criteria is a government that plans to treat each of these groups differently. And if that weren't the case, they wouldn't be collecting that information in the first place. The only reason they're collecting it, their plan is in place. Lies, damn lies, and statistics goes a familiar saying, and it's quite true. But statistics have even more insidious purposes for the people who want to misuse them. There are three in particular which deeply concern me and which I want to bring to your attention tonight. First one's this. Statistics can be used to confuse and to deflect issues away from their relevant fundamentals. How often have you heard an economist, politician, or a business person, or business people rather, argue completely opposing viewpoints based on the same set of statistics? Correct answer is, every time you hear a statistic quoted. All statistics are necessarily subject to interpretation. They have no other purpose or function. On their own, statistics have no intrinsic value. A statistics which says X number of people get killed on our highways every year could be used by both the people who think that our roads are too safe or by the people who think that our roads are safe enough. I mean, your judgment has to be presupposed by what you interpret as an acceptable or optimum statistic to begin with. So if there's 100 people getting killed on the roads on this certain stretch every year, and that stretch is 10,000 miles long and has 3 billion cars a day on it, that would not be a high statistic. So it has to be all relative to where you're coming from in the first place. Suppose a statistic revealed that 15% of the population is unemployed. Assuming that government action will be taken, a statistical approach to the issue would simply involve what has been euphemistically called redistribution of wealth, just to even things out. The issue of whether it is moral or not, by law, to force working people to subsidize the unemployed or employers to hire people based on race or whatever other choices we force upon people by law, the whole issue is completely avoided when you use statistics. And I think we have to face our moral issue square in the face or we will simply not survive as a nation or as free individuals. Statistics never provide answers. They present problems that wouldn't even exist if the statistic didn't exist. Which leads me to my second point on statistics. Statistics can be used to measure things that don't even exist in reality, like the value of unpaid labor in the home. Now this is a tough one for some people. The very idea of assigning a market value to work in which there is no exchange or trade taking place reveals such a thorough ignorance of economics and of values that it is so profound it defies any adequate expression of outrage or ridicule. It's round squares and square circles all over again. But people get so easily confused. They confuse the fact that they themselves may value the work that they perform for themselves with what the objective process of how economic value is actually determined out there on the free market. Now, to begin with, the term unpaid labor is in and of itself a political hot potato. When I first heard that term, I assumed unpaid labor meant work that maybe somebody did for somebody else and the guy owed them money and never paid them. That to me is unpaid labor. But paying yourself is like an oxymoron. There's no such thing. It's not unpaid labor to say that I haven't paid myself. Labor has three distinct meanings and applications. One is political, one is economic, and the other one's more personal. The personal definition of labor would be pretty simple. Physical or mental exertion or work, or just a physical task. The economic definition, however, refers strictly to wage-earning workers. That means people who are earning money. There has to be two people involved in this transaction, two or more. And then you've got an economy. While a political definition of labor would refer specifically to unions and the labor movement that hold a legal monopoly in a given economic area. And of course, we could also say, I suppose, that women go into labor when they give birth. Should we count that as unpaid labor too? So you can see how this all leads up to things. Asking people what they think their own work is worth to themselves is an unreal question, and it's bad economics. The real value of something can only be determined through supply and demand on a free market and by observing actual monetary transactions that really do take place between people. Yet that incredible process of all the unlimited numbers of individuals freely negotiating monetary transactions amongst themselves is the only way that we can objectively measure the value of anything. That's it. Meaningful economic measurements must relate to profits and to production, which are basically the same thing, but which both refer to work performed over and above basic maintenance. That is to say, surplus work that you can change or exchange with someone else or trade with someone else. And we do that with this other medium of exchange that we call money. So, does this mean that the work we do for ourselves has no value at all and doesn't impact the economy? Not at all. Quite the contrary, in fact. The work that we do for ourselves in our own businesses and homes is already being accounted for and measured in the pricing system of a free market. For example, if more people fix their own cars instead of taking them into the shop for the repairs, the demand for auto mechanics would drop, thus causing a corresponding drop in their prices. Now, the person who fixed his own car in his garage would certainly have been justified if he were to say, hey, I saved $100 or whatever it might cost him, but fix his own car instead of going to the shop. But this is the point. Neither his labor nor anyone else's money directly entered into the marketplace, and therefore no objectively measurable economic transaction occurred. He could have just as easily said, hey, I saved myself $1,000, or I saved myself $1 million. It wouldn't have made any difference. And to drive the point even home stronger than that, if you look, in fact, if he hadn't fixed his car and left it broken in his garage and decided to start walking instead, economically, the situation would still be the same. The professional auto mechanic still wouldn't have a job. At least not from this guy. So in fact, unpaid labor is already taken care of in terms of our knowledge of its impact on prices out there in the economy. But in terms of measuring the market value of unpaid labor, the value of labor that you do for yourself on a market is always going to work out to zero. It's zero. That's the way it works out when you calculate it, and I'm going to prove this to you. That's because, even though you may personally value your own labor, whatever economic transaction might occur to reflect your valuing of your own labor is always going to cancel itself out. Here's what I mean. Suppose cutting your lawn was worth $25. You'd have to show both sides of the transaction in order to reflect some sort of an economic issue going on. You would have to record income, even though there wasn't any, at $25, and you would have to record your expense, even though there wasn't any, at $25. 25 minus 25 is 0. What the advocates of measuring unpaid labor are always ignoring is that if you actually had to hire somebody to cut your lawn for $25, you would have had to have that $25 in your pocket first. Where did it come from? If you're working for yourself, where did the money come from that you paid yourself with? Can you buy a house from yourself? Can you buy a car from yourself? You simply cannot buy labor from yourself. It's a non-definition. You can't even define the terms. And yet this is the kind of thing that we are expected to support, and the kind of ideas we're supporting when we fill out the census. These ideas are already accepted. They're taken as a fact. And they're totally ludicrous. If these things are entered into the way our government is going to behave, unreal statistics with unreal measurements, we're in big trouble. And I'll tell you, this is going to backfire on the people that want it. Because the minute the government starts saying that there's an economic value to the work you do for yourself in your own home, this is what they're obliged to do. They've got to tax it. And that's where they're going, folks. That's where they're going with this. Wow. And this is the process that happens all the time. Now, my third and most important point about statistics. And that is this. Statistics can be used to evade issues of morality, values, and ethics in the consideration of objectives. More specifically, governments can avoid identifying the false morality on which their actions are based, what I call the immorality of equality of result. Equality of result is both the standard and the objective by which the government will interpret all the statistics it collects. It is the very existence of government equity laws and the process of wealth redistribution that is tearing this whole country apart. You cannot make people economically equal by law. To even entertain such a notion requires that we make people unequal before the law. It thus requires a violation of every individual right that exists, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, of association, of thought and religion, and you no longer have a free country. Game over. That's why I put it to you, that participating in the census means participating in the very destruction of this country. The questions we're forced to ask in virtually every government census are dangerously leading questions. All of them. They're leading us to our self-destruction as a nation. So let me make one thing perfectly clear in concluding. I will not participate in this census should it come up again and somebody comes knocking at my door. I didn't the last 2 times either, and nothing dramatic happened to me. They did finally track me down. Two nice ladies finally came to my door during the last census, knocked on the door. I said, hello, this is how many people are there? I said, 4, thank you, goodbye. That was it. That was my census. Didn't answer any of the other questions. And that's what they did. So it's, in a way, it's an easy issue that you can sort of break the law without much fear of reprisal. And I do believe that good citizens should break bad laws. But that doesn't mean doing what we saw in Queen's Park yesterday. I think legitimate civil disobedience never requires violating anyone else's rights or destroying anyone's property, as we have been recently witness to. It merely requires the withholding of our consent from those things in which we do not and should not believe. So when it comes to Census 96, you can count me out. When it comes to helping Dick Field and Voice of Canadians on this coming census, you can count me in. I hope you'll give Dick and the Voice of Canadians your most utmost support. Money, money, money is the name of the game, folks, because it's amazing what a handful of people can do with a bigger handful of money. It's just amazing. And I hope that everyone here will take this message to your friends, to your neighbors, to everyone else that you can think of, and give Dick's name to them and give all these folks' name to them and help out the best you can. And that's about it for me tonight. I guess we're having a question period. Is that the idea, right?
Open it up.
Great, we'll open it up to questions. Yes?
I have one word to say in praise of census, and that is that if you have done any work in genealogical researching, it is useful to be able to go back to the census. The first Dominion census was 1871. It's the one after Confederation. And then there was a census every 10 years after that.
I'm going to write that down. You're the first person that actually knows the year of the first Canadian census.
Well, it's simply 5 years after Confederation, which was 67.
Good assumption, yeah.
Now, there were provincial censuses before that held on a provincial basis in Upper Canada and the Maritimes and so on. After 71, they were held every 10 years. It is not usual to have census every 5 years.
So that's a recent trend then.
And that's, yes, that started, I would say, not more than 4 censuses ago. My memory now may not be exact here, but we have not had census every 5 years. That is a new trend. But I would like to say anyone who has looked at those old censuses, those were basic questions that were asked.
The early ones, yes.
They were useful.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that in those days our governments were not sadistic organizations, and those censuses were not released. It was the genealogical societies throughout this country that first got the census released so that genealogy people could go to the archives of their province and try to find out about their ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
But what has happened recently is what has been happening in this country in every facet. We are simply being governed by a totalitarian system.
Well, absolutely, and that's why I say...
Therefore, they are using every tool that they can possibly use to our destruction.
Exactly.
The census is just
Has
another
become one of
one
them.
of them.
Right.
But I would like to know exactly when this every 5 years business started.
Well, you've got me wondering about that now, because I know it's gone back at least 4, like you say, because I've seen the 86, the 81, 76, 71.
Because
So-
that is costly, and it's unnecessarily costly.
Yes.
And the other thing that I'd like to mention, in the early days of the census, it was done by a census taker who went around and asked the same questions to every farmer, every householder, whatever. And it was he who sent in the results to the government. And that can be done in this day and as it was done back then. We may have a larger population, but that is the way the census ought to be done.
It's funny you say that, because when I look at, and I have a number of people mention it to me, that in looking at the current census, even the, quote, legitimate questions on it, these statistics are available through many other sources. I mean, you have municipal tax rolls, provincial tax rolls, you've got registrations of citizens, you've got all kinds of ways of getting, of having a rough head count of how many people are in the country. And I'm not going to deny for a minute that there isn't value to some of the data collected. That's not the issue again. The issue is not whether to whom is the data valuable. To whomever it's valuable is the person who should pay for it, not to the people to whom it's not valuable. That's the basic issue that we want to distinguish. So I'm certainly not going to deny that, even a census on, like I said earlier, on sexual positions or whatever may have some value to the right people, but I don't think we should be paying for it.
I just have one sort of thing to say, and that is that this is a British-founded country, and there were a census in Britain, and it's just something that's been traditional with us. They were not ill-used, and if we have British traditions, if that's our founding, then there's nothing basically wrong with the census for the sake of a census.
I agree.
But it's the fact that, like every other thing in a totalitarian state, it's being used to our detriment. And one of the things I think that we should object to is this every 5-year business. It's totally unnecessary.
It's a real interesting thing too, One of the problems with the census, as we found out in one of our other issues that we got into, was that the government is really, as far as business and other interest groups are concerned, the government is so inefficient that a lot of the information is out of date by the time it's ready for use, because it takes about 3 years for them to prepare everything and get it out there. This year it's going to be even worse. The information is going to be out of date within 2 weeks after it's collected, because they moved the date up to May the 14th. And it was really funny in that article you handed out at the Montgomery Patent Society last week. There was a quote there, I think it was Golden Mail, wasn't it? Saying that they moved the census up, get this, for the reason because they know that legions of people move and change their addresses and their place of residences on June 1st. So they wanted to get them all before they moved. Now I'm sitting here thinking, I'm going, if these legions of people are moving on June 1st and they want the census on May 14th, well, that gives the 3 weeks legitimacy to any statistics that they're collecting in the first place. It's gone from bad to worse. I mean, if you go through every justification and read some of these newspaper articles, you're going to get some laughs. It's really become ludicrous.
Did you know, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Did you know that about a year ago, Reader's Digest magazine made a report on Statistics Canada, and it was the opinion of the magazine that Statistics Canada had become a dishonest organization and did not honestly report their information.
Well, I can tell you something. I wasn't going to say this, but I used to be a senior corporate accountant for a company called Canada Permanent Trust Real Estate. And it was my job to fill out the Statistics Canada reports every 2 weeks. And I'd get the report in, and it would ask us what we paid out in commissions and wages and what our gross income was and all that, and we'd have to report it regularly. So I'd go to our books, I'd fill everything out, I'd send in the report to Statistics Canada, and they said that wasn't what they wanted. And I said, well, what kind of information do you want? Well, we want to measure this and this. And I said, well, how do I figure that out? We don't really keep track of those kind of things. Oh, you just have to figure it out somehow. So I made it up every 2 weeks. I did that for 5 years. And I know all kinds of people in the business who do Statistics Canada reports who just make something up, put it on there, send it in. The government reports it and sell the information to businesses, so I guess make decisions on it. But it's the only way to get around them. Their answers are already in their head before they get them.
I got a little bit different question for you. The Freedom Party wanting to become sort of like the sister cousin of the Reform Party on a provincial basis? And if you are you going to run a candidate in Bob Gray's old riding?
We don't consider ourselves a sister party to the Reform Party. We did endorse the Reform Party in the last federal election. We are a distinct party. We started as a completely separate from any other movement. Like, we're true grassroots. I mean, we didn't come from any other pre-existing groups, lobbies, or anything. In fact, we didn't even have an issue we were concerned with. When we got Freedom Party handed to us basically on a silver platter is what happened. We were running a newspaper in the London area, and another group that had registered a party here in the Toronto area didn't need it anymore, and they gave it to us, and we started the party. And we sort of went the business approach to deciding what our party was going to be called, what it was going to stand for, what kind of government the country needs, and we went on that basis, and we're still in our infancy. We act very much like a lobby group. I do this full time. We're always campaigning on various issues, on so many issues. Like, if you went through a file of our newsletters and our record of action, you get some idea of what I'm talking about. And it's been quite a learning experience, and then now I'm feeling really good about working with guys like Dick and other groups like this who are interconnecting. We've got a lot of reformers in our group. We have a lot of conservatives too, and we're even pulling in a few old-time liberals. So there is progress being made, but it's very slow. It has to be a steady thing. You keep at day in and day out. Then you do see results. It does happen. In fact, I'll tell you, when we started with Freedom Party in 1984, the political environment was incredibly different. Even the very ideas that we're talking about here publicly now, even though they're still so politically incorrect, you couldn't even bring them up 10 years ago. That's how bad it was then. So we are improving, albeit slowly. Yeah.
In your opinion, would you say that filling out the reduced census form might constitute unpaid labor, and therefore you can...
Why not? And assign a very high value to it while you're at it.
When I heard about the question on unpaid labor, it didn't occur to me that it applied to such things as what you might term hobby work, such as repairing a car, which my husband does, but I don't consider that unpaid labor. However, I do consider when I do unpaid labor, because he doesn't have to repair the car. I mean, he could take it somewhere else, but I do have to prepare meals, I do have to do the laundry, I do have to do the ironing, I do have to do the mending.
We all do. See, we all start on that even ground level. It's not an economic transaction. Economic measurements occur when we start mixing with each other. It's a social concept, really. And the work we do for ourselves in economic terms is not you can't measure it.
I wouldn't consider that I merited any special treatment. However, our daughter-in-law, who lives in Regina, stays at home and looks after and has raised her 3 little girls. One of them is in school full-time, and the other one just started kindergarten, so she's only there half days. Now, I do feel that what Judy is doing is of benefit to society in various ways. One of these ways is that she is doing the very best job she can do, or anybody can do, by looking after her 3 children that she and my son have brought into this world without expecting somebody else to look after them. If she went out to work, she would be doing a job such as bookkeeping. She's not a highly educated girl. She would have to probably, I think, I don't know much about, since I raised my own children before I went back to work, I don't know what the pay would be for bookkeeping, but she probably would have to have subsidized daycare for the one child who is at home full-time, for the little girl who would be outside school half days, and for all 3 of them at lunchtime. And I'm told she's not home to eat. So she is saving society, that amount of subsidization.
Well, you see, you're starting from the premise that society owes that subsidization to everyone who has kids. I think that's a false premise to start from.
No,
I
they
think that,
don't subsidize everybody who
No.
has kids. They subsidize those children whose mothers are working but not earning sufficient. I mean, imagine the cost of paying for 3 children for...
you know, where I thought you were going to lead with your question was the issue of women, for example, who are at home taking care of their own kids and cannot benefit from the same kinds of tax exemptions or you can get the tax credits from a working spouse.
Well, that's another point.
Well,
I
you
was
see, that's
just-
because we have a terrific article on that in one of our newsletters there, just on the front page right there.
I was just in Regina 2 weeks ago. I was there for 2.5 weeks. And our son was telling me that he pays 40% of his income in taxes. And he said if Judy were working and filed a separate income tax return, their combined tax would only be 25%. And that is an inequity.
Well, I agree. That's a different issue a little bit than what we're talking about here. But you might find that article real interesting because it hits right on what you're talking about.
Yes. Do you want a form?
What do you want for the,
Bob, I just wanted to say, I just wanted to ask you to explain a little further
go ahead, what do you want to do?
why you think the question of unpaid labor is on the census
Yeah.
in the first place. Because my opinion, knowing how governments work, is that they're trying to find a way to be able to tax housewives at home to further the tax intrusiveness into the family situation.
7-1.
That's what I think they're trying to do.
7-5, 7-1.
No, that's exactly what it is. And that's why I said it was backfired. A lot of the lobby groups wanted, some of the lobby groups who wanted to get it on there were hoping that it would qualify them for things like government pensions. They could state a value of what they did in the home, they could get government pensions and things like this. Well, those days are over, even for the people who have government pensions the old-fashioned way. The government can't afford that anymore. So, but you're right, that's where you're going with it, and that's what scares me about the census.
I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but what is the consequences of not filling this going up? Did I hear you correctly? There's fines and stuff?
Yeah, the maximum $500 fine, 3 months in jail,
So this
and or both.
So this is the real issue, then?
That's
the
the
fact that you're forced into doing
That's
this.
the only issue.
You know, statistics are.
And remember, we're
it's a
also
big deal.
forced-
Most
Right.
people are asked to do it, and they either accept or they don't. But this is a case of, you're coerced into this. Isn't this some kind of violation? Can't this be challenged in the judiciary somehow?
It's never been done to the best of my knowledge. They keep telling us that no one's ever been fined or jailed, although I know of a couple of exceptions ourselves. There's a business developer in the city of London who was charged both times and taken to court for not filling out his census. But that's because he created a high-profile situation out of it. When you go public and you tell other people that they have rights, I'll tell you, the government's going to be after you. And that's how they use the law. It's never uniformly applied. It's applied against the people who stir the waters a bit.
So if we don't fill these out, we're subject to.
I think if you don't fill it out, the odds are about 50-50 that someone will come knocking at your door.
So it's
All
like
they'll
it's
do
like
is ask you how
taxation.
many people are in the house and it'll go away. That's what they generally do.
And okay, did I hear you correct in that they put another, the way in DC, the Reform Party member had that extra box in there for Canadian? Did I hear you correct on that? That's in there, so.
It's on there now. Canadian is on there now.
So what you're saying is fill that out, and then it won't be so consequential like the
Well,
results of it.
that's a sort of a separate issue. It's really funny too, because it's funny that they would now include the Canadian as one of the options, because up until then, they were adamant about the fact that anybody who filled out Canadian on there would skewer the results of the census. So anybody that does put Canadian on there is going to skewer the quote results. Remember what that means when they say it skewers the results of the census. It means if you're screwing with our plans. We want to know how many people are this color and that color. We don't want to know how many people are Canadian. And that's what they mean when they say it will skew the results.
Well, where does it say that?
Oh, it's in the newspapers. The
Oh, it's in the
representative of
newspaper.
Statistics Canada and people who have spoken on behalf of the census have been very, adamant about not having Canadian on there, but they had to give in. The pressure was pretty strong.
So that the option's there,
It's there.
and, so, all right, so the object is to fill that in.
One more question. This lady just
Just a comment, not a question, that for the purposes of Voice of Canadians, we really need to at least fill out the number of people in the House and forget about all this other stuff until we get to the section on race, and then we check off Canadian.
Right.
If I didn't fill it out and didn't send it in, if they came after me, I'd say, well, that's not my problem, you didn't get it.
Yeah, a lot of people do that, and then they'll get out another one and tell you have to go with it.
Yeah, and I say, no, I'm sorry, I already did. I don't trust you, I'm not gonna do it. I sent it, all right, it's not,
That's right.
you have to say I sent it. You say you didn't get it, that's not my problem. Give them a hard time. Yeah, sure.
Since the census is anonymous, how do they know whether you sent it in or not?
Because the censuses are already pre-marked. They know your household number. And that's where the issue comes in. They don't know who to charge if the census doesn't come in. If
It's not really anonymous.
it's anonymous, not in that sense, no, it's just a number instead of a name.
Bob, I'm sure will stay for a little bit of time after, and you can ask him personally any more questions. I'd like to thank Bob very much. And you know what I mean, that Bob, when he goes into something, he knows what he's talking about. I couldn't help thinking when he was talking about the census and the history of it all, and I couldn't help thinking about how draconian this thing could really be, and really is, when you think about it, social engineering. And the last one that had the correct name on it was William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book. You remember that? William the Conqueror took the census all over the Isle. Beg pardon?
Domesday and Doomsday.
Yeah, right. And that was for the purpose of gathering taxes and so on. So we're into the same thing, to manipulate us. In any event, last year, for those that are worried, last year I got very angry because I had one of the long forms, and it had all that ethnic stuff on it. And they will have this year too, a big block. And I blackened out the whole block except for a diagonal bar. And I put Canadian. And I said something I shouldn't have at the bottom. But U-S-O-B, you know. And I filled everything else out. I never got any hassle at all. Nobody got it. And then I looked at the census results. And 3% of Canadians must have done something similar last time, because it said 3% marked something else. And so I'd like to see that maybe 35 or 45% this year. 75 would be good. Anyway, thank you all for coming and for a very pleasant evening. And please stay. I think we've got some time. Have some coffee, chat, ask Bob questions, talk to our people here, and please have a safe trip home and support the Voice of Canadians as strongly as you can. Thank you very much. Oh, don't forget Pat Ryan's request for volunteers to learn about communications and help with the raising of funds by talking to our members and other people. Thank you very much. If anyone's interested, Jean has the paper back there.
I need a ride. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I live with my mother, so I personally never had to fill out any census by myself. I think my dad was European and he's really on a credit, so as far as I know, he probably filled them out on my behalf without me knowing it, but I never filled any by myself. I never filled any out by myself. I don't know what my dad wrote about me.
Maybe you could do it, don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'll just unplug the microphone here. And it's when I couldn't make driving close.
Yeah.
So what's that mean? Yeah, I know. I could tell you why it's not good, but I think I can work I don't think everything's proper. I don't think they want to know. People say they want to know. It comes down to
There's no way I'm going to know. Just that I don't know which one is of the so
I know where. I know what happened. And I know which control. Why did we find out? I think
I was acting as a government.
Catholic Church, but we don't follow because they are sharing and caring kind of.
We're a non-profit organization.
Well, I didn't want you to mention my name. I just wanted you to say what somebody gave you and hoping that others would have gone along with it. You know? But I don't think anybody. They should have passed. You should have passed the next one bucket. How are you? Good. Okay.
Just out there was a lot of other things.
They want
That's all. Of course it's planned. People don't realize these people have been looking like it's frightening because here's where business isolation. This is the way you should it's not you have to. Here's the best way to listen. You follow this it's voluntary. Drop down and listen on it. The state tells you what you do. People don't understand that. They can't see it. They just cannot see it. Because I think right away, it's Catholic.
Okay, I'm hoping to get a sticker for my car. There's a sticker I told you I have. I'm waiting till my car gets clean.
No, I'm just saying.
Right over here. So anyways, I'm hoping to get a sticker.
But it's the same one. Okay, or I want to get yours, yeah, so I can. Yeah, don't go. Genovese? Not Calibrate. Okay. What? Oh, yeah, I'm gentle. Right. Ron, I'm gentle. Humans have such a insidious religion because, like they say, their church is, the ways. As long as they have the word, that's the scary. That's just what religion is. You destroy Christianity, which is the foundation of life. You like to believe in God. You want to destroy the church. And that small Christian church. Just don't get problems. We're not have all the problems. The whole concept of God is very real. But here, you talk
Probably the circle or something like
Unfortunately, they are fighting the same that I'm having in my own church. The people that have the power are the humans and bosses and got into the hierarchy. And they're trying to control.
Still going.
The North American Catholic Church